everyone to what I think is probably one of the most critically important webinars or seminars that EMET has ever done in our history. And we've had some very important webinars and seminars. I am really honored and privileged today to introduce you to Sarit Zehavi, Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zehavi, who is with Israeli intelligence. And she is a very, very accomplished woman who has started her own extremely important organization called Alma, which is a think tank devoted entirely to what is going on with Israel's northern borders. Sarit has briefed members of Congress, members of Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the European Parliament, scores and scores of journalists about what is happening there. And she keeps her eye on the ball of everything that has been going on in the very, very active situation on Israel's borders, not only with Lebanon, but with Syria. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zehavi.
Thank you very much. I must say from a personal point of view that Alma is a think tank that is based in northern part of Israel. I speak to you here from my bomb shelter at home. It's 2 square meters in Kfar Vradim, a small community about 7 miles from the Israeli-Lebanese border. All my staff are living in northern part of Israel, so we don't only read about what is happening, we experience what is happening. Yesterday, while I was talking with Sarah, we heard the jets just above our heads, and this is something that happens a lot. I don't need to read about the Israeli attacks in Syria. I just know when they are because I hear the jets over here. And Alma is completely independent and not non-partial. Our mission is to supply or to provide information about northern borders of Israel, because we truly believe there is lack of information, and we only have an hour. I will try to be very focused, but there is a lot to talk about. So I will begin with, the very initial statement that actually Israel deals with a front with Iran. Iran is miles away from here, but actually Iran is only a few miles from here on the Syrian border and on the Lebanese border. Only yesterday there were two attacks that are attributed to Israel in Syria against probably Hezbollah military capabilities of missiles in Syria, maybe also some chemical capabilities in Syria. And if I've mentioned Syria, I just want to say a few words about what's going on there. In Syria, the Shiite axis, what we call Shiite axis, and I'm sharing a map with you now, actually won the war. You can see in my map that the pink areas are areas that are allegedly under the control of the government, but actually they are under the control of the government and its allies, which is Iran and Russia. Not always same interests, but bottom line is that you can see a lot of yellow squares over there. All these yellow squares are actually militias, Shiite militias that the Shiite Iran had founded in Syria. And some of them are also deployed not far from the Israeli Syrian border next to the Golan Heights over there. The orange areas are areas that are dominated by the Kurds. In the middle of the orange area, you can see a blue strip, which is an area that the Turks took over, and they have joint patrols there with the Russians. Left to it, you can see a green area, which is actually the area that was left to what we used to call rebels. But actually today, it's dominated either by Turkish affiliated groups or by radical Islamic affiliated groups, or sometimes they are the same groups. Over there in this, what we call Idlib area, there are battles there, sporadic battles all the time, and allegedly a ceasefire. It's a Middle Eastern ceasefire, meaning that there is sometimes a cease between the fire. Moreover, you can see a light blue spot next to the border between Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. This is highly important since this is the border crossing between Syria and Iraq, where actually you have a presence of the American. That's why it is painted in light blue. If I am now trying to share with you another map, and I'm taking like a zoom out, and I'm looking at the map, which is all the way to Tehran, you can see that, can you see my clicker, Sarah? Okay, so you can see the light blue spot over there, and this is the shortest route that goes all the way to Tehran, the ground corridor, this is called, that enables Tehran to transfer ammunition, soldiers, merchandise, to bypass the sanctions into Syria, and from there into Lebanon. The fact that the Americans are here doesn't mean that it completely blocked the corridor, but it means that it is putting a lot of difficulties on this corridor, and actually the Iranians need to use a different way, which goes from over here, which is much longer than the one that is blocked by the Americans. And that's why the presence of the Americans over here is highly important. And yet, that's not the only way to win the Iranian presence in Syria, of course. That's why you hear about so many Israeli attacks there. Israel is not going just to sit still and wait. This presence is highly dangerous to Israel. I know there were publications yesterday that Iran is withdrawing from Syria. I don't know, we don't see this happening. It's not within the interest of the Iranians, though all the economic difficulties and the American sanctions, they continue to put a lot of efforts in their deployment and military deployment in Syria, including by using Hezbollah on the Israeli-Syrian border, where Hezbollah already established 2 units over there, Golan portfolio and the Southern Command, 2 different units, but actually for the same cause, which is building an infrastructure against Israel. Now I want to move to Lebanon, which is the most of our meeting today. We'll discuss what is happening in Lebanon. And you know, I'm a researcher and I served many years in intelligence, which means that I am very careful from decisive statements. And it took me a while to say decisively that today the government of Lebanon is dominated by Hezbollah. And it's funny to say this, especially at this time that this government was founded after a protest in Lebanon that included a protest against Hezbollah. But this is the Middle East. There was a protest which included a protest against Hezbollah, but actually Hezbollah gained a huge achievement by this protest, and the new government that was founded is composed of ministers that are completely part of the Hezbollah coalition, let's put it this way. So this is the political situation, by the way, that is based on a sectarial key. Lebanon is a unique country in the way its political system works. The head of parliament in Lebanon will always be Shiite. The president will always be Christian, and the prime minister will always be Sunni. The prime minister holds most of the authorities, so you may say, okay, great, he's Sunni. No, because it is based on a coalition, by the way, just like in Israel, and that's why he can't do whatever he wants, and it's always a coalition. And the current prime minister that was nominated a few months ago, following the process, is a Sunni prime minister, but actually is an ally of Hezbollah. The situation in Lebanon is extremely difficult. The economic situation is extremely difficult, not only because of the COVID-19, even before that, huge debts in Lebanon, lack of medicines, lack of food, Syrian refugees that were absorbed in the cities of Lebanon, taking the jobs of the Lebanese, a tourist sector that was damaged greatly. And that's why, by the way, people eventually went out of to the streets with this protest. But again, it doesn't stop Hezbollah from trying to get over the systems in Lebanon. And the COVID-19 became from a risk to an opportunity, because Hezbollah was the only one who had the capabilities to go to massive campaigns against the virus, including giving thousands of doctors and nurses, establishing compounds of tests and medical centers, having a campaign of explaining the population why the lockdown is very important. Everything was led by Hezbollah. Now it looks great, social movement, working for the benefit of the population, but actually they also benefit an opportunity to promote their own narrative, to promote their own messages. And I'll just give you one example, but of course we have many like this. This is one photo from one of the areas where there was food. They provided food for the people. You can see the vegetables in the baskets, but behind that, you can see a poster of Soleimani and his friend Abu al-Muhandes. Both were killed by the Americans in Iraq a few months ago. They're actually the commanders of the Shiite militias in Syria and in Iraq. So this is just a small example of how the Hezbollah narrative is being promoted all the time by these civilian infrastructure. Which is actually, if I may summarize this part, this is the enabler to the military capabilities that Hezbollah is developing in Lebanon from inside civilian population, inside the villages in South Lebanon. That's how it is possible. And from here, I want to move to discuss all these military and security issues. This week, we are mentioning 20 years to the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. And, you know, people in Israel are asking the most important question, actually, for us: was it good or bad? Was it good or bad to withdraw unilaterally, withdraw with no agreement with anybody? And allegedly, and I'm saying this as you know, I was a regular soldier in the 90s. It was my friends and my husband's friends that were killed in Lebanon. And for us, living in Lebanon was good news. Wow, okay, we are out of there. It's a cursed place. But for many others that are living on the border, the situation is much more complicated. Meaning that less soldiers are getting killed. We are not at war, a daily war anymore. But the situation is not completely calm. And actually, since I'm mentioning 2006, which was the second war with Lebanon, since then, Hezbollah completely changed. This war happened after the withdrawal, while Hezbollah kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers from inside Israel, and ended with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 that said that South Lebanon should be empty of any illegal weapon. Who should enforce this? Depends who you ask. If you ask me, I'm an Israeli, it's the UN that should enforce this. Only yesterday there was a debate in the UN Security Council. First time Israeli ambassador said, well, we should think about it because it doesn't happen. The UN does not enforce the resolution. Actually, if you ask the UN, if you ask the Europeans, it's not the mandate of the UN, it's the mandate of the Lebanese Armed Forces. They are the one who's supposed to enforce the resolution. The Lebanese Armed Forces was deployed for the first time, actually, after 2006 in South Lebanon, realizing the Lebanese sovereignty in these areas. And there was an expectation that they would be the one who would stop the Hezbollah deployment, military deployment in South Lebanon. This, of course, didn't happen. Quite the contrary happened. I mean, until today, it's been 14 years since 2006. The Lebanese army didn't find one single rocket of Hezbollah in this area. And we are talking about tens of thousands of rockets that are stored inside the villages, in the Shiite villages of South Lebanon. What is happening? I will use the flyer, and I don't know if you received it, and if not, Sarah will send it to you later. I want to show you a flyer that we made just with the main points about Lebanese army. First, let's begin with the photo here. This is a funeral of a Lebanese army officer. But what is interesting, and I hope you can see my clicker, are the flags behind it, which are the flags of Hezbollah, yellow flags of Hezbollah in a Lebanese army officer that died, I don't know, in the battles on the Syrian-Lebanese border against ISIS, meaning that they were fighting together against ISIS. I'll show you another example for fighting together against ISIS. So, interestingly enough, an example that we found on the website of the Lebanese army. So it's a Hezbollah flag, it's a Lebanese flag, and these are soldiers. At first, when we look at this photo and the website of the Lebanese army, we thought that these soldiers are a Lebanese army soldiers, and okay, they were fighting with Hezbollah flag, again, on the Syrian-Lebanese border. But later we find out that these soldiers are Hezbollah soldiers. And their photo is published in the Lebanese army website as an expression of the joint effort of Hezbollah and the Lebanese army against ISIS on the Syrian-Lebanese border. By the way, in a violation, a strict violation of the American demand not to do that. Hezbollah is using the assets of the Lebanese army, vehicles, towers that we can see. If you come to the border, you will be able to see the towers that were built by the Lebanese army, but we saw Hezbollah operatives on the tunnels. When I visited on the towers, when I visited one of the tunnels, in a minute we'll speak about Hezbollah's tunnels. When I visited this tunnel, the Lebanese army built a small tent, a small position next to the border, watching the Israeli works next to the border. And in one of those days that I visited the site, I saw a civilian standing on the other side, coming in and out from the Lebanese army tent and in and out from the UN tent, which they were next to each other. This was not a civilian. This was Hezbollah member. And we already know how to recognize them. We understand a civilian didn't have anything to do over there. You have Lebanese army uniforms. You have UN soldiers. What was he doing there? Ali Shaib, the reporter of Hezbollah, published photos from this that were taken from this place towards Israel. I could recognize the photo from where they were taken since I was there. And he's a Hezbollah member. And he was standing there just next to the Lebanese army position. We know that Hezbollah are joining Lebanese army patrols along the borderline. We know that in some of the families there could be one brother from the Lebanese army, one brother in Hezbollah. You cannot defer Hezbollah from the Lebanese army. And statistically, most of the fighting forces of the Lebanese army are Shiites. So it's really very difficult to defer Hezbollah from the Lebanese army. And this is what I was trying to show you over here in the flyer. It's not my analysis. This is the reality as the Lebanese themselves see it, as Hezbollah itself was promoting. This is the narrative, that there is actually an equation where you have a coexistence or a triple existence of Lebanese army, Lebanese people, and Hezbollah. So instead of showing you, this script that we've made, I'll just show you a memorial that was made in one of those towns next to the border, next to the Israeli-Lebanese border. You can see the flowers. This photo was taken last year in the Independent Day of Lebanon. You see the children wearing the uniforms of the Lebanese army. Fine, no problem. That's the Independent Day in Lebanon. But when you read the Arabic here, so it's a memorial for the martyrs of the people, the army, and the resistance. The word resistance in Arabic means Hezbollah, or means the resistance to Israel. All the organizations, groups that are resisting to Israel, and the leading one is Hezbollah. The leading one in Lebanon, of course, is Hezbollah. So this is why when we saw this, we understood how inherited this perception is in the Shiite towns in South Lebanon, right next to the border with Israel. I must relate to the question of potential threat or potential warfare between Lebanese army and Israel. And there are a lot of debates about that between the experts in Israel. And I'll bring you my own point of view. I believe that in the next war, the Lebanese army will participate against Israel. Now, many experts in Israel are saying, but it didn't done that in the past. Why do you say it will do it in the future? Remember that in the past, the Lebanese army was not in South Lebanon. So we are in a new reality in South Lebanon when we speak about Lebanese army deployment there with about 4 brigades. It's not, a huge threat to Israel. We can deal with that, but it will happen. Just before talking to you, I had another debate with my researcher, the head of the research department in Alma, and we agreed that the Lebanese army will participate in the future war, but from different reasons. He said he will participate because the Lebanese army is completely doing what Hezbollah is saying. And I said that it will participate first and foremost because it cannot leave Hezbollah to be the only protector of Lebanon. The Lebanese army would also want to build its image as the protector of Lebanon. So that's why it will fight against Israel. So in any case, it will happen. And in both scenarios, there will be cooperation, intelligence cooperation, for sure, and maybe more than that, against Israel. Why are we? I said that the Lebanese army is not that kind of a threat to Israel. Okay, it's it will participate in a future war, but we are much more worried from Hezbollah. Why are we that worried from Hezbollah? What are the military capabilities of Hezbollah? I want to point out 2. The first one is the artillery capabilities. Hezbollah is holding more than 100,000 rockets in Lebanon, rockets, missiles, various ranges. Bottom line is that they are pointed to Israel. They can get to various ranges from where I live and further to the south, covering almost all of Israel. They cannot reach to Eilat, but to there we have other threats. Now, during all these years, and I've mentioned that I'm sitting in the shelter now, we are used to this. It's funny to say it, but we are used to this. We are prepared to these kind of scenarios. What is more troubling is that we are not sure that in a scenario of huge amounts of rockets that will be launched at the same time, or a scenario of accurate rockets, all the preparations that were made will be enough. And this is what Hezbollah is actually doing now. It is putting a lot of efforts along with the Iranians to make these rockets accurate. Now, every now and then rockets are being shot from Gaza to Israel. Until 2006, we had a lot of incidents that rockets were shot from Lebanon to Israel, but most of them fell in open areas. So it was easier to deal with. It's not easy enough because it's living with the sounds of the sirens, but when we speak about accurate rockets, this is completely a different scenario, which is much more troubling. IDF says that Hezbollah failed to create an industry of precision-guided rockets project, but succeeded in having probably a few hundreds of accurate rockets. And that's the constant campaign that is going on when I'm talking about alleged Israeli attacks in Syria, when I'm talking about Netanyahu speaking in the UN, exposing Hezbollah's assets. It's all about this project of making the rockets accurate. But actually, it's not only the rockets, it's also what we call Hezbollah's offensive plan. Hezbollah is no longer a group, organization, or militia. It's an army. Lebanon has 2 armies. This is how we should look at that. and Hezbollah is the stronger from the two. Lebanon has two armies, meaning that Hezbollah, when I'm speaking about the withdrawal, in 2000, Hezbollah was a small militia of 600 soldiers in South Lebanon. Today, the plans of Hezbollah are of about 6,000 that will try to enter into Israel, either above the ground or below the ground, to enter into the communities next to the border. When I'm saying communities next to the border, 7 miles, like myself, it's far away. I mean, a few feet from the border. So that's the offensive plan. Enter into Israel, attacking these communities, either from above the ground or below the ground. Let's begin from below the ground. I want to show you a short video. I hope I will succeed with all the technology of the tunnels. IDF found 6 border crossing tunnels. 6 border crossing tunnels along the Israeli Lebanese border. Here you can see a video that we've made. This is the road that leads to the tunnel. That's the border. You can see my ticker. Can you see my ticker, Sam?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that's the border. I am driving right along the border. All these white pipes are the tries of the IDF to find the tunnel. And in a minute to get to the tunnel, I'm moving forward. That's the UN barrel that marks the border. They mark the exactly national big border. The tunnels were found in a joint of intelligence, operational officers, engineers, geologists, everybody worked together and these tunnels. It was a project that lasted a few years. For Hezbollah, it lasted a decade to excavate the tunnels. For us, it lasted about 5 years to find the tunnels and to dig and excavate just behind this wall over here and to find the tunnel. We are next to the longest, deepest, and most impressive tunnel of Hezbollah. It's about half a mile long. The opening is in Shiite town in the Lebanese side. It's about 250 feet below. You can see myself walking inside the tunnel while the stairs were made by Hezbollah. All the pipes are original by Hezbollah, air conditioning, phone lines, electricity. Now, that's a long way they come from the ground. There's a lot of that evacuated the waste. Where was the UN? Where was the Lebanese army? I don't know. Give you a few more seconds just for your impression. This is highly difficult to excavate since it's rocky soil. It's not easy. It's a huge project. It costs millions of dollars. We managed to stop the project. How do I get out of that? Can you see me now, Sarah?
Yes, the quality of that wasn't so, in terms of the voice quality. So I will just, if anybody has any questions, you know, I know about this, so I can respond to your question. If people want to email me, I can respond to their questions. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, while the video was on?
Only while the video was on, the voice quality wasn't great.
Okay, so this is a lesson we are learning how to do it. Okay. I said above the ground as well. I'm not going to show another video because it will create all this troubleness with the voice. But what I want to stress is that only 3 weeks ago, Hezbollah sent us a clear message. You know, we speak an unspoken language with each other. Israel attacked a jeep of Hezbollah next to the Lebanese-Syrian border without killing any Hezbollah operatives, in order to send them the message that we know what they're doing. And Hezbollah sent us a message by breaking or making 3 holes in the fence along the border between Israel and Lebanon, in areas that are very close to communities, making us understand how easy it is to penetrate into Israel and to get to these communities and killing people. So it's either beneath the ground or above the ground, this offensive plan of Hezbollah.
Would you like to just address a little bit about how now that Hezbollah has amassed this huge army on the border, how it's easier to attack the convoys and the forces in Syria?
The convoys and forces in Syria, Israel was very careful. First, in Syria, in opposed to Lebanon, this ammunition is not stored in civilian areas. So in all these about 1,000 attacks that Israel carried out in Syria in the past few years, there was 1 civilian that got killed by the Syrian fire against the Israeli jets. Second, Israel was very careful, refraining from killing Hezbollah operatives. And it happened twice, deliberately. But whenever it happened, Hezbollah retaliated. And it retaliated on the Israeli-Lebanese border. And we know that if Hezbollah retaliates on the Israeli-Lebanese border, again, with this unspoken language, the potential to escalation is greater. And that's why this, what we call gray zone campaign, or Mabam, that's the word in Hebrew, is very careful, tons of risks and opportunities here, but we have no other choice than to do it, because we don't want to get to war, and we don't want to get to war in a scenario that they gain so much power that we cannot win the war. So let's open it for questions now.
Okay, all right. As the moderator, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question. As you know, Sarit, Benji Will, our wonderful staffer, and I have been working very, very hard for the last several months, circulating a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, signed by several members of Congress, and we're still continuing with this campaign, asking that we suspend our military aid to the Lebanese Armed Forces until such a time as we can be absolutely assured beyond a shadow of a doubt that none of this is going into, directly or indirectly, into the hands of Hezbollah, and to just examine the relationship between the Lebanese Armed Forces and Hezbollah. Now, a few staffers for members of Congress have given us pushback, saying we've called up the Department of Defense and we've spoken to generals there, and they've told us that the Lebanese Armed Forces is doing a wonderful job of acting as leverage against Hezbollah. First of all, what do you have to say to that?
I'm not sure whether to laugh or cry. Can you hear me? I must ask, yes, because I have noticed that, yes, you can't hear me. Lebanese army, in opposed to what many Americans think, is not an alternative to Hezbollah. Okay, if this is why you're giving the aid, it's not a good enough reason. Lebanese army is, as I've said, coexist with Hezbollah. It's not an alternative. In South Lebanon, Lebanese army is doing nothing against Hezbollah. That's clear. As I've mentioned, not a single rocket was found until today by the Lebanese army, a rocket of Hezbollah. By the way, they found a few rockets of other groups, but not of Hezbollah. And they have enough information, okay? I'm saying that with full responsibility. They have enough information to get to these rockets, and they are not doing so. As for the leaks of the ammunition, I don't know. I must tell you that it doesn't bother me that much. It can happen. It's an option that this ammunition will get to the hands of Hezbollah. I'm not sure Hezbollah needs this kind of ammunition. It has enough of its own. But it will be used against Israel by the Lebanese army.
Okay, my next question, before we turn to the audience for other questions, is some staffers have said to us, but if we don't give the money to the Lebanese Armed Forces, they're going to go into the hands of Iran and Russia. How would you respond to that?
I agree. There is never a vacuum. If you will not assist the Lebanese army, somebody else will assist the Lebanese army. So I think the question is how to assist the Lebanese army. I think the question is how to make the right. I'm sorry?
Have some sort of oversight for what we're giving them. Have some accountability.
More than some sort. Have a strong oversight of what you're giving them, where it is going, and what you demand back. This is the most important thing. Why? Ask yourselves, why are you doing that, and what do you want to achieve? You are not doing that for creation of an alternative because it's not working. That's for sure.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to turn the mic over to our very, very confident and capable Sarah Leah Thompson, who is going to be reading in some of these questions that have come in.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much, Sarit, for speaking with us and for all of the information you've been sharing. So we have a number of questions already. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer all of them, but we'll do as many as we can. So our first question, according to the IDF intelligence, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, Hezbollah has facilities in Beirut where they turn dummy missiles into precision-guided munitions. While Israel can intercept shipments of the missiles, how can Israel eliminate the threat of those facilities?
From an Israeli point of view, we don't use the word eliminate. And because we don't know what we don't know. So we attacked what we know of, but we probably didn't attack everything. So it's not that easy to attack these convoys. It's a massive effort of intelligence, Air Force, to be there on the right time, the right place, with the right intelligence, the right bombs, without killing civilians and without killing Hezbollah members. And that's why we are very much troubled of this project of making the rockets accurate.
Next question.
Thank you. Similar to that kind of question, until laser technology is developed, what can Israel do if Hezbollah decides to overwhelm the Iron Dome system by shooting dozens of these precision-guided munitions at once?
Defend. Two things, actually. Defense. Okay, I will divide my answer. Before the war, we are doing a deterrent. We are creating an effective deterrent that though tomorrow they can launch all these rockets, they are not doing so. And that's one of the two missions of the IDF, to postpone the war as much as possible to create effective deterrent. The second mission is to be prepared. I agree that Iron Dome will not be enough. And that's why a lot of efforts are being invested in first, developing the Iron Dome more and more. And we need more systems, more batteries. And second, to create home front defense, which is shelters, sirens, alert systems, etc. It's not enough.
Thank you. We have a similar question. submitted by two of our viewers. So with all this new threat of the precision and non-precision missiles, Israel, the IDF has had such a high standard for maintaining, giving warnings before launching on enemy sites, but considering the new threat that the IDF is facing, do you think that Israel would at all relax its standards in order to respond to this new threat, or maintain the same level as standards with preventing civilian casualties on enemy lines, etc.?
There are strict rules in international law about collateral damage. Every officer in the IDF know them, and we all following these laws. Each decision of attack is approved by a legal consultant. I was in the Northern Command. I could see the process. I was part of the process. I don't know about easing, but it's a process of decision making that you make in wartime, and you make all the efforts that you have to warn the population. We cannot force them to leave. We don't control the area, but we can call them to leave. We can warn them, and we can make sure that they will get the message. It's for them to decide whether to leave or not. That's a great challenge. I don't deny it. I think that's when we speak about winning the international community arena, that's the greatest challenge, because outside of Israel, people don't understand what we are facing and how tough is the decision to fire against, not even a mosque, against a building where you have rockets and a Lebanese family, and if you don't fire, you don't destroy the building in Lebanon, you may cause to the destruction of another building in Israel.
Right. Thank you so much. So next questions we have. One of our viewers is worried about the next Hezbollah war, possibly including Syria and Gaza and perhaps the West Bank. Do you have any thoughts on the possibility of that?
It's a possibility. It's a very challenging possibility, but it's definitely a possibility. To remind you, in 2006, didn't start from the Lebanese border. It started with the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit in Gaza. The kidnapping of the 3 soldiers in October 2000 was right along with the opening of the Second Intifada. These two fronts are active together many times by the interests of Hezbollah. Hezbollah will not come to help Hamas or to rescue Hamas and sacrifice itself for Hamas, okay? Hezbollah will use the Palestinian blood as much as possible without harming any Lebanese blood. But three fronts war, it's definitely an option.
Okay, thank you. Another question about that. So with Hezbollah takeover, as it were, of the Lebanese government, effectively, what is the possibility of another civil war or a new regional war with Israel?
It's two different questions. The Lebanese are horrified by a civil war. Horrified. They would do everything they can to avoid another civil war. They are experienced with 15 years of civil war in Lebanon and 8 years war in Syria. And they don't want the same destiny, and they are willing to pay a lot of prices to prevent this kind of war. I don't see this happening yet. And I think that the main reason it's not happening, it's not only the Lebanese fear, but also the weakness of the opponents to Hezbollah inside Lebanon. As for war with Israel, you can never know. It can be tomorrow or in 10 years. We just don't know. As long as Hezbollah is deterred, as long as Iran is deterred, the chances to war are smaller. But they are not zero, since we are walking, all of us are walking on very thin lines. I hope this is the expression in English. What I mean is that imagine a scenario of a gradual escalation. Israel attack a convoy. You mentioned the convoys. And deliberately or not deliberately kills Hezbollah operative. And then Hezbollah retaliate on the Israeli-Lebanese border. And eventually succeed in killing Israelis. What didn't happen? It killed 2 soldiers, succeed in killing civilian Israelis. And then Israel retaliate and killing few Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon. And then Hezbollah retaliates, and then you get into war that actually nobody wanted. This can happen.
Thank you. So the next questions we have are on a separate topic, more related to coronavirus right now. Are the field hospitals that are treating wounded Syrians in the north seeing any patients among the wounded that have coronavirus? And are these hospitals testing for the virus?
There are no field hospitals that are treating wounded Syrians in Israel. All the wounded Syrians that were treated in Israel were either went back to Syria or to a third country, and it's all this beautiful project of the good neighbor completely ended when the Syrian government took over the Syrian side of the Golan. This was almost 2 years ago, in the fall of 2018. And since then, this project was completely closed. So we are not worried of any spread of COVID-19 into Israel from either Lebanon or Syria.
Got it. Thank you. And I think our last question for now, unless more come in, will medical aid to Lebanon be worthwhile to give as it will go to Hezbollah?
I was hoping that somebody will ask this question. I think that the only way to win this war against this Shiite axis is to use their weapon. And their weapon is not a weapon. Their weapon is social movements, is civil society efforts. If the West will succeed, and this is long-term plans, in creating alternative civil infrastructures in these countries, local, not American infrastructure in Syria or in Lebanon, Lebanese infrastructure, civil infrastructure that will be able in time, it's a process, to replace what Hezbollah is giving to the population, whether it's medical or welfare or educational, doesn't matter. Eventually, it will create an alternative that doesn't exist today.
Thank you.
Okay. Was that the last question that's come in?
Just one more. Thank you so much. So we've had a lot of questions about the various sects in Lebanon, their relationships and the tensions and the dynamics. Do you have anything that you could comment about that?
Yes, first let's talk about demography. And I'm saying it very carefully because demography in the Middle East is an enigma, okay? We assess, our assessment is that out of the 4.5 million Lebanese citizens, in a minute I will talk about those who are not citizens, almost half are Shiites, about 20% are Christians, and about 20% are Sunnis, maybe a little bit more. About 5% are Druze. Those who are not citizens, meaning on top of this, you have between 500,000 to 1 million Syrian refugees that were absorbed in the cities in Syria. And we have about 170,000 what are defined as Palestinian refugees. I disagree with this term because it's fourth generation of Palestinian refugees. Most of them are living in refugee camps, that's funny, without no civil rights in Lebanon. As for conflicts, it depends in which area. In South Lebanon, we see cooperation between Christians and Shiites. Hezbollah definitely managed to penetrate to these places as well. Sometimes there are small conflicts when Hezbollah tried to impose, for example, ban of alcohol, but it didn't succeed. In Beirut, we see more conflicts, definitely during the protest. The protest in the summer in October was a protest also against Hezbollah, against all of the government, but including Hezbollah. And we saw riots in South Lebanon in the cities, like in Tyre, or in Beirut, or in Nabatea, protest against Hezbollah. The problem is that the Shiites in Lebanon don't have any alternative. Again, don't have any, even if they are against Hezbollah and the other Shiite group, Alma, ran together as one party in the recent elections.
Okay, a couple of things. One is, I'm sure you're aware of this, the Shiite scouting group is called the Mahdi scouting group, which is basically is a training ground for young boys to go into Hezbollah, and they have LAF, Lebanese Armed Forces uniforms that they put on them with their guns pointing towards Israel. And the fact is that, as Lee Smith wrote in a phenomenal article several years ago, quoting Osama bin Laden, if you have a choice between a weak horse and a strong horse, particularly in the Middle East, you ride the strong horse, you bet on the strong horse, and the strong horse right now is Hezbollah. So we have to look very carefully. I know that Lebanon is a very interesting ethnic country, and for one brief moment in 2005, between February and March, there was an optimistic moment of the Cedars Revolution where secular people and Christians felt free to walk through the streets of Beirut. However, this it was a long time ago, and things have gone downhill. And one of our problems is that we are always looking at foreign situations in America with one snapshot that's been frozen in time. So we are not there on the ground as Sarit Zehavi is. And we have to rely on the Israeli army consults with the American army, so we should know better. But we should be relying on the Israeli intelligence that have to live in that very tough neighborhood. I would like to make a pitch for you to support Sarit's organization. Please, she's doing incredibly important work. And you could go to their website at israel-alma.org. She is an amazing woman, and Mother's Day is coming up this Sunday. I didn't even mention, aside from all her other accomplishments, she's a mother of 5 children, and is managing to get this phenomenal information to us. And I'd like also, if you can, Sarit, can you just email me your video, which was hard to see. I would like many people to see this video so that people could understand exactly, where things, where the fence was penetrated, and, and you inside the tunnels, and with the explanation so that they see firsthand. I don't want American policymakers to make their decisions based on old, outdated information. So please support Sarit, and of course, please give us a message of hope. If you can, someone asked me that the IDF is capable of handling all of these threats before we close. Do you feel that the IDF is?
We have no choice.
Thank you. And I also got another message, and don't forget to support EMET also at emetonline.org. But we're very, very grateful to all of you who've tuned in today, and especially for the number of staffers that I see from members of Congress that have tuned in today for this incredibly valuable briefing. Thank you. And we will see you next week for some other amazing briefings that we will tell you about. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Sarah.
Thank you so much. God bless you, and good luck to you. Stay safe.